because some folks are not able to make it to this, and we're wanting to get informed about the topic. So before I turn it over to Ben, just want to give a really brief overview of what we'll be discussing today. Thank you for signing up. That I will be monitoring the chat. We will have some time for questions and answers at the end, and we will also always be open for future meetings or discussions offline if there are longer form conversations that need to be had. I'll monitor the chat. If you have questions, I'll be following those. We'll answer those at the end, and we'll give Ben ample time, probably 20-25 minutes, to go through his presentation. But just want to uplift the fact that this is about building social housing through the private market's boom and bust. As Americans, we believe, we are taught to believe that the private market is supreme, that the private market is the way that we get the vast majority of our goods. We have really been conditioned to not believe that government has a large role to play in anything. And the importance of this presentation is to juxtapose that to how social housing and how housing as a public good is really addressed in countries and through governments around the world. So this presentation will really get into the role that supportive international governments and cross-income subsidy play in the success of social housing development. It takes government, it takes political will, it takes political movements in order to create housing as a public good. So as you will see throughout Ben's presentation, you will probably be really hopeful and inspired by seeing the policy choices and the government backing that some of the countries that he'll discuss have given to social housing. We unfortunately do not have that here in the United States yet. We are working on it. Multiple other jurisdictions are working on it across the United States. This is a growing movement. We will have social housing in our future. And just hoping that you pay attention in the back of your mind to the policy choices these governments play to supporting social housing development, and maybe questioning to yourself, what are the ways that our government actually prohibits the creation of housing, prohibits the mass escalation of housing that we need to meet our need, why we continue to see rising in homelessness. These are all policy choices. These are not based on anything else than prioritizing the needs of the few over the needs of the many. So with that, I do want to introduce Ben Furlow. Ben is our field director for Initiative 137, was the main architect with a strong field team to getting enough signatures for I-137 to be on the ballot. But Ben's background, just really briefly, he has a double major, one in political science and one in economics from the University of Kansas. And prior to working at House Our Neighbors, he was a policy analyst at the Department of Commerce, but left that job to come work to advance social housing. So really grateful for him being here today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Ben.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And again, thank you to everyone joining us here today to learn about how social housing can build through the boom and bust cycle, and what policies, as Tiffany mentioned, that governments around the world use to support social housing developers to allow them to build through the cycle to meet that public need. So first, we really need to understand kind of what is the problem, the underlying problem at hand here, right? What is the boom and bust cycle? Next slide, please. So the boom and bust cycle, it's also often referred to as the business cycle. Basically what it is it's this cyclical thing that private markets go through in capitalist economies. And there's a lot of things that go into what causes the boom and the bust, but broadly speaking, boom periods occur when there are factors that increase productivity, right? So things like population growth, new technologies, new access to resources, government infrastructure, or even just expectations about future growth are all things that can lead to this boom, okay? And then for a variety of reasons, and economists kind of, depending on who you ask, agree and disagree on what are some of these underlying reasons, business investments start to slow down. And when this happens, there is a decrease in demand for goods and the labor that produces them. And when you have, of course, a decrease in demand for labor, you have a decrease in wages, and this contributes to an even further pullback in that demand because of the resulting decrease in spending and consumption. And then this cycle, this underlying phenomenon, usually coupled with some kind of shock, right? Like a financial crisis, an energy crisis, or sometimes a technology shock, or very recently, as we're all familiar with the COVID pandemic, that was an external shock, right? This is usually something, one of those things or something else, then triggers that bust, right? Which leads to a decline. As you can see in the graph over here, right? This is where it starts to decline, and then you have that contraction, and prices slash business investment starts to decline and decline and decline. And then eventually there is some lower bound there, some trough, right, where things decrease in price enough that business investment makes sense again, right, to get back into the market, which brings us back up to our growth period, right? And this continues, on and on and on, right? And the reason why this is something to care about in the context of housing is because private developers are very much exposed to this business cycle. As we see in the next slide, housing production is incredibly cyclical, right? These gray bars that you see over here, so this is Federal Reserve data. These are housing starts going back to the 1960s. And you can see very clearly a cyclical behavior, and usually housing starts start to decrease either before or during a housing or a market-wide bust, right? And so during these bust periods, private developers are producing less housing. And this is problematic for us because population growth continues even throughout the business cycle, right? So the amount of supply that's being added to the housing stock does not match up with the growing demand for that housing. You've got a mismatch here. In fact, you can actually, I would really actually like to point out to the fact that since the 2008 recession, you can see that housing starts per year have not recovered from where they were prior to 2008. Now, this is a 2008 recession specific deal, but you can see just like from recent history why this is incredibly problematic. It can take a lot of time to recover from this, right? And this is obviously not good, right? This is one of the main contributing factors to the housing crisis that we are dealing with. It's this mismatch between demand and supply of housing, right? It's incredibly acute to the point where even people at moderate to high incomes are starting to feel the cost burden from a lack of supply, right? So why we care about this, right? It would be obviously much nicer to have a public option or some way to build housing through that bust period, so we don't have this incredibly cyclical market behavior that is leading to a undersupply of housing, right? Now, having a social housing developer, a public housing developer on its own isn't enough, right? You need to stand up that developer with lots of resources, lots of institutional support, both for the fact that you can just get the best bang for your buck if you're going to be spending taxpayer money on this in the first place, right? You want that to go very far, but also for the maybe more important cause, which is to serve the public interest to the greatest extent possible by building as much housing through this cycle, right? And there are three main things that I'm going to talk about how governments around the world, and later towards the end, some public policies that we actually have here in the United States and locally, that these governments use to support social housing. And they fall into three broad categories, right? Which is about capital, specifically borrowed capital, land, and revenue, right? To stand up these social housing developers. So the first one is, of course, capital, borrowed capital, right? So on the next slide, we learned a little bit about these loans, who lends them, and the rates that they are set at, right? So loans are necessary, right? It's great to have a financial instrument to borrow money now so you can get started, rather than saving up money for a few years or whatever, and then spending that down the road. Once you get that money to start building housing, you in the long run end up producing less housing, right? Or just we're all familiar with borrowing credit now to pay for things that we need now, as opposed to saving that, right? But the problem is that these rates can be pretty expensive, right? So for private multifamily construction, the loan rates from private sources are anywhere between 5.5% to 7%. This is like more or less the industry standard. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. And you can understand how high loan rates can contribute to higher housing costs, right? If a private developer has to borrow money at a really, really high rate, that makes it prohibitive for them to offer rents that are either at a low cost and or to not raise rents year over year in order to pay off that loan, right? So we need them, but they can be expensive. And part of the reason also why we need them is not just for the sake of building more housing or over the long run or getting access to that money now, but you also need them because over the course of a project, stuff can change, right? So project costs, they can fluctuate. They can fluctuate from inflation. They can fluctuate from mistakes that happen while you're building. And so, I don't know, something spills or there's something wrong with the foundation, or I guess a local example is anyone who's familiar with Sound Transit, the East Link connection, right? Like the floating bridge that had to be redone. Stuff happens, right? So it's good to be able to use these loans, this financial instrument, because loans can be extended, they can be refinanced, they can be expanded as necessary, right? And I mentioned these characteristics in comparison to grants, because grants are a one-off deal, right? And this is problematic because, as I already mentioned, right, new stuff can come up, there can be new requirements, mistakes, what have you. But also because grants are often, this is more of a political problem, but grants are very much subject to austerity. And since we're talking about building housing through a bust, right? Grants often, because of these austerity measures, the amount that governments are willing to hand out during recessions or during economic downturns is significantly lower than what they'd be willing to offer during the good economic times, right? So a public housing developer, social housing developer that's overly reliant on grants ends up, being subject more or less, right, to the exact same boom and bust cycle. So it's much better to have access to these loans. And this is where public institutions can step in and help out, right? So public housing developers and social housing developers around the world, they often receive preferential loan rates as low as like 1% to 3%, right? And they're able to get these really low rates because they're getting them from pension funds or from public banks or from other public development authorities or from sovereign wealth funds. These are all institutions that play a really fantastic role in offering low loan rates, and they're able to do that because they're loaning that money for the public benefit rather than for the pure sake of shareholder enrichment / just making the highest rate of return possible, right? In many countries around the world, I listed a few right here that explicitly have baked in loan policies, preferential loan policies, right? But there are other public institutions around the world that do offer this to their social housing developers, even if it's not like an explicit in law thing. So that's the role that loans can provide, can help social housing developers succeed by offering these lower rates, so that way public developers are building at a lower cost just from the get-go, right? And don't have to raise rents as much from year to year. Now, it's good to have really cheap capital, but you got to build that housing on top of something, right? And that something is land, right? So land is incredibly important. You need it for any and all developments. And in the next slide, there's actually a really great graphic about this to kind of demonstrate the point. So land can be expensive and also messy. Land is usually 10 to 15% of a project's cost. This is for multifamily developments, to be clear. So it's a thing that's expensive, and it's not really something you can control, right? It's an expense that you have to hand out there because, like I said, you have to build on top of something. And on top of the cost, right? Developers, this is the messy part, they have to oftentimes negotiate with multiple property owners, right? So this can be a very litigious process. It can take years to get through this, right? And then even once they acquire the land, oftentimes there's already something on top. So they have to pay teardown costs. There can be the legal fees going through the negotiation process. That can be expensive. Those costs often get passed on to the tenants that will eventually live there. And then there's also the limiting aspect here, which is that depending on how many parcels of land you're even able to get from this negotiating process in the first place, that also significantly limits what you're able to even build in the first place, right? So this is where public institutions can step in, specifically land banks, but also just public land transfers anyway. So most like city or county or even the federal government has land, right, that they're not using, or it's vacant, or it's called surplus land, right? And that land can be transferred to a social housing developer for housing use, right? Which is great because it cuts down on costs, going through all that, legal shenanigans that I mentioned. It's also a huge time save, right? Because you're just negotiating with the government, right? So you have to go through 3 or 4 years of litigation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can start building housing much faster. So the social housing developer can focus on doing what it does best, which is building housing. A great example of this is actually going on right now up in Vancouver, BC. So the Jericho lands was formerly like military land for barracks or whatnot. Anyway, it has been owned by the city government for a long time, and they decided to give this land transfer to First Nations. I think 3 of them that collectively own it, if I remember correctly. And so the nice thing about this is it's one big package. It's this large plot of land. And so when you have a large plot of land like that, you can get creative, right? You can build not just a ton more housing, but you can get fancy. You can build some mixed use development. You can have lots of open space. You can design the transportation within that development, however you wish to create a more enjoyable experience for the people who are living there, which is exactly what the Jericho Lands project is doing. It's estimated to have, I think, should support 13,000 people. And I think at least over 30% of these housing units are set aside as social housing, with the rest as market rate, if I remember correctly. But it also does have a ton of mixed use development. Now, if you look at that image, compare it to the equally sized plot of land that's directly, I think that's south, let's pretend it's south. Just right there in that rectangle, right, there's maybe 50, 60 individual property owners at least. If you wanted to have a similar size development, imagine the headache it would go through for a social housing developer to have to negotiate and try to buy out all these properties, right, to develop into something similar. It's a huge time and money sink, and they wouldn't be able to build the same kind of development, right? So public land transfers, long story short, are great. It takes care of this super duper important aspect of social housing development, right? So once you get the land and you have the ideally cheap capital to build social housing on top of that, it's even better if you have direct tax revenue or cash transfers from the government to help further expand the social housing stock. So governments around the world that have social housing developers, they often do have a dedicated or an informal but pretty much formal cash transfer policy to give to their social housing developers. And this is really important because it provides an extra cushion of financial stability for the social housing developer, right? So if you have a consistent revenue stream outside of the revenue that you would get from collecting rents from the tenants, which we'll talk about on the next slide, having this additional revenue stream is fantastic for the social housing developers' financial stability, because first of all, right, obviously it boosts the developer's credit rating. So this goes even further towards allowing the social housing developer to get favorable loans, not just from public institutions, but if it also wants to borrow extra money in its capital stack from private sources, it can get even better loans from them, right? And it also, as I mentioned at the top of this, right, empowers the social housing developer to continue building out additional social housing stock rather than relying entirely on cheap capital to expand the housing stock, or the profit or the surplus that you would get from collecting rent from tenants in the buildings to then use that to expand the social housing stock. So it helps it go even further towards expanding the social housing stock, which is super important when you want to build through the bust cycle, right? To have that consistent revenue. And social housing developers around the world use a tax revenue source to stand up and support their social housing developer. So in Vienna, for example, which is one of the most famous examples of social housing, they actually have a citywide income tax, half of which is paid for by businesses and the other half by the people working there. Now that raises about $240 million a year, which in context of Vienna population, I think is 1.5 million people or so. So I guess proportional to Seattle, that's like around $100 million a year, right, per population. In Singapore, they go even further, right? In Singapore, in 2021, the government provided 3.4 billion US dollars to the Housing Development Board, the HDB, which is their social housing developer, to cover the cost of housing construction, because they sell/rent out their social housing there at affordable rates, right? It's not to make a profit, it's done for the public good, which requires this cash transfer to cover that. So lots of tax revenue investment going on over there in Singapore, but also in Vienna as well. So this is the thing that governments do all the time to add that extra cushion for financial stability and to further empower the social housing developer to expand that housing stock, right? So these three categories of supportive governmental policies, they're really important because the overall goal/purpose here is to bring down the cost of building the social housing, right, for the social housing developer. That's more or less kind of the whole point, right? Because if you're going to offer affordable housing, the cheaper you can build that housing, the easier it is for the social housing developer to offer that affordable housing, right? And in the context of social housing, the reason why it's super important to bring down these costs is because social housing fundamentally relies on a mixed income model, right? Mixed income models can go really far towards providing affordable housing, right? But you can understand why by bringing down the costs of actually building that housing in the first place, then a mixed income housing model means that you can have in that mix a larger portion of people who are making on that lower levels of area median income, right? The less support that a social housing developer gets, obviously the less people that it can, the less low income people that it can provide affordable rates at, right? So now we're going to talk about the cross income subsidy, how that works, right? So like I said, social housing developers, they use this model, and it's a model that is works incredibly well because first of all, this is how private developments work, right? Private developments, like within a building, right? There almost is never such thing as a tenant who pays exactly for however much their housing unit costs, right? These costs are always spread, and this is true not just for housing, right? This is true for airlines, for example. This is true for healthcare systems, right? Costs are shared and spread at some point, okay? Especially when these things are going on over a long period of time, right? And when you have a diverse mixture of tenant incomes, right? Specifically when you have, low and high income tenants, then you're able to go even further towards covering those costs through cross subsidization, right? And this is really important because this is what allows social housing developers to build out more housing. And this is kind of also on the flip side, a limitation that exists with income restricted affordable housing, where in those housing developments, it's usually capped at 60, 65, or sometimes 80% area median income and below. And so because all the tenants or most of the tenants are paying into the housing costs less than what it actually costs, that extra cost has to be covered through subsidy, has to be covered usually through LIHTC tax credits, and what have you, and other subsidies. So by having a mixed income model, by having more high income tenants paying into this, right? This is what allows that to actually pencil out. And it also means that the projects get paid off faster, as a result. So you get higher cash flows for expansion. The other part of cross-income subsidy that doesn't get touched on as much, but also is really important, is the role that commercial rents can also play in bringing in more cash flow, right? Especially when we're talking like mixed income developments, where the first or second floor is commercial space, right? Typically speaking, there are exceptions, but typically speaking, commercial rents on a like per square foot basis tend to bring in a higher rate of return than residential. So if you have that within a building, that goes even further, right, towards the cross income subsidization, right, where you can take like the high profits of commercial cash flows to help subsidize the residential units themselves, right? And also, as I mentioned in there too, it's like it makes the development itself more desirable. I think we would all, if you're going to live in a multifamily building, it'd be pretty nice to live in one that has like a grocery store on the bottom floor, or a daycare, or any kind of great business that serves the community, right? And you see this, so this model, this mixed income model. The graph here on the right, so this is from a study that's comparing the Austrian versus the Irish social housing model. Little context: the Irish social housing model relies almost entirely on grants. Hence why I mentioned that like a few slides earlier about how grants are very much subject to austerity, right? So this is the market-wide. This includes both private and public housing starts, right? And you can see, during the 2008 recession and a little bit before, there's a significant decline in housing completions per 1,000 people, right? Whereas in Austria, I don't know why 2003 is blank, but you see that the housing completions, right, is pretty static. It is able to build throughout the whole thing, and I have a couple more examples in the next slides, but this is in practice, right? The benefits of a mixed income model. I'll also say too, just briefly, there are some social benefits to this, in my opinion. There's less stigmatization from concentration of poverty. And just generally speaking, having mixed income communities is also great. There's a lot of research about how mixed income communities goes really far towards bringing people up the income ladder, right? I don't think it's controversial to say that a lot of income growth, or a lot of career growth, or just what have you, right, is due in large part to social connections that we form, that goes really far towards helping people not just grow, but also like if you fall on hard times, right? It's great to have that community that you can depend on. And the more diverse, economically and otherwise that community is, the further that goes, right? So this is just, I guess, a testament to the benefits of diversity, especially with economic diversity, right? So, like I said, more housing gets built as a result of the combination of the mixed income model and supportive policies. On the next slide, we see graphs about in Singapore where this plays out, right? So this is just a great example of how this is the further time range than the Austrian versus Irish comparison. You see that the housing supply, right, is pretty static throughout the 2008 recession, right, continues to grow. And then on the right, of course, you actually see the amount of public and private housing stock that is added. And I actually really love this graph on the right here, because it includes the vacancy rate, which for those who are really tuned into the housing market discourse, right, being able to have high vacancy rates like that, right, is a real testament to how much housing supply is being built. I mean, having a consistent 6 to almost 9%, a little over 8% vacancy rates, right, is huge. Even over the course of 20 years? Yeah, almost 20 years, right? So again, testament to what you can do when you have a lot of money going at and a lot of public institutional support towards the social housing developers. So the long story short, right, is these institutions and financial support creates a smoother and more stable housing market. And so, next slide, please. So the result, right? More housing stock gets built through the boom and bust period. And there's also a really nice effect that building out this social housing has, which is a moderating effect on rents. You saw this from the previous slide about high vacancy rates, right? Which we know that, when vacancies are low, rents or rent growth tends to be much higher, and the inverse is true, right? Yeah. And so in Austria versus Ireland here, you see that over time, right, the change in housing prices in Austria, where they have a very robust social housing market, is much more moderate. It's between like -2-ish and 5% growth. So rents, they still continue to grow over the long term, but they grow at a much more predictable and typically at a lower rate, right? And this is, again, both because more social housing stock is added to the broader housing stock, right? But also because the housing itself, right, is built cheaper. So the social housing is able to afford to offer lower rate increases from year to year. But there is also a bit of a competitive effect in there as well. I like to compare this to the U.S. Postal Service, right? So we can imagine how in a world where the USPS didn't exist, how UPS, FedEx, DHL, and whatnot, right? How those rates would be significantly higher, right? But thankfully, we have the USPS. So there is a public option, a very well-funded and high-quality public option, and that's the important part, right? That is able to compete against the private market, that forces the private market to offer cheaper and or higher quality services in order to keep up, right? So it's kind of like the really nice benefit of having this public option, especially, again, a well-funded, a well-built-out public option. And the more that you fund and build out that public option, the greater it can do to create that moderating effect on market-wide rents, and also to build higher quality, cheaper, and more social housing to serve the public benefit. So with all that in mind, there's a few key takeaways that just kind of like, go over everything we talked about that we want to take away from this. So the main thing from the top, right? In a dominant private housing market, private developers are sensitive to the boom and bust cycle. They build the most during the highs, and then they pull back that construction during the lows, when public investment has lower returns, / it doesn't make as much sense to invest, right? And in the long run, right, this volatile market behavior, it means that not enough housing is built for everyone. And even if enough housing is built, because of the high cost, it's not guaranteed to be affordable for everybody, right? But with regular funding and ideally a diverse sources of funding and other resource benefits, right? A social housing developer is able to build through this boom and bust cycle. So the result is you get more social housing, you get more affordable housing stock, right? And the further this goes, and in a social housing environment where the developer is very well funded and very well supported, it's able to actually have a market-wide moderating effect on rent prices, right? So that's the first thing. And I should also add too that when you don't have a diverse set of benefits, supportive institutions and whatnot, like with the Irish social housing model, where it's highly dependent on grants, the social housing developer can kind of go through the same boom and bust cycle, right? If its sources of revenue, if its sources of support are themselves like all reflective of the boom and bust cycle, then you basically just have another developer going through a boom and bust, right? Which is not good. The second thing, right, kind of segue into this, which is that successful, and again, emphasis on that, right? The most successful social housing developers around the world utilize government support. They do this for their lower interest rates, for the cheap capital. They get this through the cross-income subsidy, right? And just legally allowing them to do that in the first place. They get that through direct cash transfers. So that way they have higher cash flows, for better credit ratings to get even better deals on borrowed capital, and or to also just stand up more social housing, right? And they also get, of course, right, land transfers / public land support, right, to help build an abundance of housing, and ideally a higher quality housing, right, as we saw with the Jericho lands, where you can have a much more creative, mixed use, urbanist development, right? And again, like all public infrastructure and public goods, right? Social housing, it works best when it operates, with the backing of a supportive government, right? This is true for pretty much any and all public infrastructure, especially like trains or public transit, right? I think is a great example of this. So, the more public dollars that you invest in a social housing developer, the further it can go towards serving the public, right? And again, ideally, a diverse set of those public dollars / resources like land, right? And then I think maybe this is the most important takeaway for the short-term context being here in Seattle / King County, right? Which is that local governments, as well as federal governments, that's a whole thing to get into, but local governments do have a really fantastic role to play to support social housing, right? So Washington state pensions, there are several that are able to invest in real estate, including public real estate, that can provide preferential low rate loans / investments, right? The Seattle Scares Fund, the retirement fund, can also invest in public real estate. I think like 12% of its funds, something like that, already goes to real estate funding anyway. The Washington State Housing Trust Fund, although that one comes, I think, with an asterisk, needs to maybe be amended to support social housing, but it does support affordable housing. The recently announced, if it does go through, the King County $1 billion bonding authority to fund social housing developments, right? That's a huge support that we could have for social housing. It's a lot of money, and many, many others, right? And I do add in here that state and county governments generally have the most financial capacity to support social housing developers. This isn't like in direct comparison to the federal government, although that is a whole other thing we could get into if you have questions about that, about why that's maybe true. But long story short, local governments have here, especially in King County and Washington, are able to support social housing developers. And land banks too, / publicly owned land, which we don't have a land bank, but the city, county, state governments do own public land that they can transfer to social housing developers to help support that. So that is how social housing developers can, with the support of public institutions, build out social housing stock and support the government or support the public interest. So I want to turn this over now to you all. If anyone has any questions, thank you again for coming and listening to me talk about social housing and how it can build through our boom and bust cycle. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was really wonderful. I do have a couple questions in the chat, and I do know that we are getting to time, so we'll ask a few of these and then also put our emails in should folks have follow-up questions. So the first one, Ben, is relating to the 2008 housing crash. Is part of our understanding of the loss in 2008 related to banking consolidation and loss of smaller, more mortgage housing-focused banks, mutuals, credit unions?
Wait, sorry, repeat that again.
Is part of our understanding of the loss in 2008 related to banking consolidation and loss of smaller, more mortgage / housing-focused banks, mutuals, credit unions?
That's a good question. I haven't seen any specific research on that. I know that largely speaking, depending on who you ask, a lot of it has to do with the deregulation of loaning, right? And what led to like that huge, what led to the recession in the first place, right? That is a good question about what role do those smaller housing focused banks have to deal with. I will also say too that just generally speaking, investment capital tends to go towards whatever has the highest rate of return, and that is something that they demand out of their loans. So I can see like the consolidation towards, if you're talking about like national investments, going towards since that investment capital is now in those hands, and so there's, I guess, more money being deployed towards higher returns. And if you have those higher returns, then like the housing costs go up, so you're not able to build as much. / the rents are going to be much higher. That's a good question. I don't know. I'll have to look into that. Yeah.
Okay. If you want to put on your chat, I can also put these in there. Another question, and then we'll go to maybe one more after this. I'll repost this question from earlier. It's dealing with pension funds. How does a pension fund not have issues from not making a higher rate of return? Do they have to balance it against something else, especially since 1% is below our inflation target? So it'd be hard to get through fiduciary review in the US.
Yeah, that was a good point. So typically what they do is, I guess in that case, the pension fund itself also kind of uses a bit of a cross model, right? Where it uses high rates from other investments that it invests in to cover those lower costs. The government also, I'm pretty sure too, I think it's in Austria where this is the case, where the government steps in and helps cover the costs of those losses on the low rates, right? To help do that. But yeah, long story short, there does have to be a bit of a covering there through higher investments. Yeah, so the low rate is like that 1%. Typically, it's usually around closer to 2 or 3%, right, where it is just about at inflation. But yeah, that 1% is where the pension itself is already receiving some form of government support and or has other investments that are able to cover that. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Another question, putting this back in the chat. I imagine this model would grow the economy too, since renters now would have more income to spend on services and goods when they don't have to pay most of their income as rent. Is this a fair assessment? Yes,
it does it in that way, and it also does it in another way too here. So yes, like they have more money that they're able to spend. So a great example of this actually is in education. So there's really good research about how people who live in public housing, or people who are not having to pay more than 30% of their income, tend to have the highest, as a proportion of their household income, spend the most on education, right? Which obviously goes really far towards higher productivity and higher economic gains, right? The other part of it too is that in the specific case of social housing, where if you have a guarantee of not paying more than 30% of your rent, and even better, if you have a guarantee of not losing your housing as a result of a change in income, this gives you much more leverage when you are negotiating with the labor market, right? So this gives you more time, more financial leverage, which means, generally speaking, whatever job you end up taking is going to be one that either pays you more and or is something that you are just better at and better serves your skills, your advantages, right? And anyone who's had high rents and has lost a job, understands the stress of just taking whatever job comes to you, right? But with social housing, you're in a much better position to negotiate with that labor market. So yeah, in the long run, it does, would lead to higher economic gains in both of those factors. Yeah.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add on to that too is in a lot of these countries, we're also looking at commercial rent control measures and investment in those also as public good. So we're also boosting up the small business sector as well, and allowing, as you say, Amar, for more people to have money to actually spend in their local economy because it's not going to rent. I mean, again, please, no one misunderstand. We're not saying these are apples to apples comparison. This presentation is showing the plethora of tools that governments around the world utilize in order to prioritize and enable the production of social housing through economic ups and downs. But yeah, we need to make sure that we're looking at everything through the context of our US regulatory framework. But yes, if you're not having to also spend, in some of these countries, a lot of your money on healthcare, that also allows the local economy to be have more money as well. But again, that's not what we're talking about here. I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to post it in here, and then any other questions we can get into offline, and putting it back in the chat. Are the revenues usually a specific currency amount or is it a tax percentage? Because tax revenues fall during a contraction, which means that it's still at risk during recession.
Great question. Yes. So it's both, depending. In the case of Austria, right, or I should say Vienna. So in Vienna, their income tax is a 1% on income, again, split between paid for by the businesses and by the people themselves. In Singapore, it's different. It's not a percentage per se. It's what it is it's just covering however much the Housing Development Board is not able to immediately recoup from the sale / lease of that housing, right? So yeah, I would also say too, though, in Vienna, right, their income, the money that the social housing developers get is not just the 1% income tax, right? It also does get financial support and money from other sources as well. But yeah, no, that is a good point. That kind of gets to the point made a couple times throughout this, that you need a diverse set of income sources, right? So that way you're not relying on just one thing that is potentially incredibly cyclical, just like the private boom and bust cycle, right? I think, yeah, Singapore is probably a great example of this, where, like I said, they just cover that they cover that gap, right, between revenues and costs of building the housing, as well as other, support that they have, like land transfers is a big one too. But yeah, great question. Diversity of sources is the best.
Okay, well, thank you everyone, and thanks for sticking with us. We did go 5 minutes over. I'm gonna just type email in the chat if anyone has further questions or wants to dive a bit deeper. But thank you so much for being here, for turning out to this. We will get this uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and yeah, please stay in the know, stay in the loop. We will have more educational opportunities between now and the election. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you.